Hi everyone, my name is Nicolle Medak and I will be presenting my capstone on the long-term impacts of U.S. military interventionism during the Cold War. So I first want to start off why we should care about the effects of military interventionism. So the United States has had a long tradition of intervening militarily as a part of its foreign policy. And we as citizens of a democratic republic and the government itself should be aware if our foreign policy has these long-term negative effects on a country's political well-being. This comes with the idea that we need to see who we are voting for and what foreign policy they are putting in place and how it can have an impact. So it really changes why we should care about this. So for my research question, I decided to focus on have countries that experienced U.S. military interventionism during the Cold War been impacted politically by this interventionism? And if they have, how so? I hypothesized that if a country experienced U.S. military intervention during the Cold War, its political well-being has been negatively affected. So there's been quite a bit of previous research. Most notably is Yoon in 1997 and Butler in 2003, who both found that U.S. military intervention during the Cold War was typically characterized by decision-making and interest being consistent with hegemonic power, structural realism, and ideological conflict. In addition to this, Kasanji and Pickering in 2015 also found that interventionism can have a detrimental impact on the quality of human life, especially when interventions in democracies occur. They're not likely to improve the quality of life of that nation, but rather negatively affect them, especially in the terms of their nourishment, their literacy rates, and as well as increased maternal mortality rates. And they also found that interventions may lead to the collapse of the target government. So because of this, I theorize that U.S. military interventionism during the Cold War has negatively impacted a state's ability to have a high-functioning political system. So this interventionism that distrusts the government and political system will affect the country's capability to function properly. And this is caused by the weakening of the target government, as well as other domestic institutions within the state. So my methodology, so first I needed to select the countries who were intervened on militarily during the Cold War by the US. And I was able to do this by using Global Policy Forum to identify those countries that experienced this between 1945, so the end of World War II, until 1991 when the Berlin Wall fell, and it was considered the end of the Cold War. And then for countries that did not experience interventionism, to compare those with those that did, I randomly selected countries that just did not experience US military interventionism. And then I ran statistical analysis regressions for the countries that were intervened on, and those were done with the following variables. So I compared them with the Global Freedom Index scores, their Transparency International corruption scores, their Gender Inequality Index scores, their education levels, as well as whether or not they were an import or export-based economy. So there were three notable variables that were tested with US military intervention that showed a regression. And those were the Freedom House scores, the corruption scores, and the gender inequality scores. So for the Freedom House scores, they ranged between 0 and 100. And the higher the number, the better or more free a country is. So if we look at the graph on the left, the dots on the left are at 1. Those are for countries that have experienced US military interventionism. And we see that majority of them fall below 60, which is not very good. It means that they're not democratic. And then we compare those to the dots on the right for 2. Those are the countries that did not experience US military interventionism. We see that all of them, except for 3, are above 50 and closer to being a more democratic free state. As for the corruption scores, again, these scores range between 0 and 100. And the lower the number is for the score, the more corrupt the country is. So if we look again at the graph on the left, for the dots on the left on 1, those are the countries that have experienced US military interventionism. We see that a large majority of them fall below 40, which is not good. It means that they are fairly corrupt. And if we look to the right, for the dots on 2 on the x-axis, we see that they are more spread out. And while none of the countries included had a perfect score, and that's actually pretty hard to get a perfect score on for corruption, we see that there is more variance among them. As for the gender inequality scores, so these scores range between 0 and 1.0. So the closer to 0, the more the country has more gender equality. So it's good to be closer to 0. And if we look at the graph, for one again, on the left side of those dots, these are the countries that experience military interventionism, and we see that majority of the countries have a score of 0.4 or higher, which means that they have more gender inequality in comparison to those dots on the right for those countries that did not experience this interventionism, who have closer scores to 0. While again, there are a few that do have higher inequalities or similar inequalities, we still see that there is more of a variance between those countries who did not experience this interventionism. So in conclusion, US military interventionism during the Cold War has had a negative effect on a country's political well-being through its Freedom House scores, corruption scores, and gender inequality scores. However, I did not find any statistical importance between the relationships of interventionism with GDP, education levels, and economy models, meaning whether or not they were import or export based. So what could this mean for the future? So it really poses the idea that we may have a change in US foreign policy as well as a change in post-conflict development. And what this means is that if the US were to recognize this work done, noting that military interventionism can really affect the country's political stability, it may change the hawkish foreign policy that we implement now by constantly using the military. And as well as a change in post-conflict development, we see that because we know that this interventionism can affect corruption and how free a country is and their gender inequality, when we go in for more humanitarian purposes, we know that we need to focus more on those three variables in order to help rebuild the state. And some implications for future research. So it would be great if this could be done on a larger scale and have a global analysis of all countries that have experienced US military interventionism, not just those during the Cold War, and as well as those who have not experienced any interventionism or just not any by the US, as well as different classifications of military interventionism. And what I mean by this is how many boots were on the ground. Was this a special ops, or was this conventional warfare with larger amounts of people? Or was it just a small CIA team that went in and did what they needed to do? So by having those different classifications, we can see what types of interventionism have more or less effects. And those are my resources.